You want to
Kick it off.
call the funding subcommittee meeting to order? We'll start off with a roll call. Peter DeLima. Bill Curtis.
Here.
Whitney Katchmark.
She's here.
Ben McFarland.
Is online.
Louis Lawrence.
Here.
Morning, Ben. Curtis Smith. Kristen Burhoff. Keith Martin. Robbie Coates. Present. Deborah Messner. Chris Swanson. Here. Chris Berg.
Here.
Jamie Green. Rachel Peabody. Randy Owen. Troy Hartley. Yeah, that's the roll. I'm going to turn it over to Matt to introduce the DCR and VCU team.
All right, thank you, Sean. Remember, Sean is the chair. Peter is our alternate chair for this subcommittee. I am the designated DCR staff person for this subcommittee. I am not a subcommittee member, so do not count towards the FOIA requirements, but you all are subcommittee members and do count towards the FOIA requirements. With myself from DCR, we also have Andrew Smith here, Deputy Director from DCR, and Carolyn Heaps-Paro, our program coordinator from DCR as well. DCR also has the support of VCU and the Center for Public Policy, and we have Wheeler Wood and Sarah Jackson here as well. We do have a FOIA officer for this subcommittee. It's the same FOIA officer for our overall TAC, and that is Michael Fletcher at DCR. So should any members receive a request for public information pertaining to this public body, please send those to Michael Fletcher and myself, and we will handle the FOIA responses. All right.
So the next item is adoption of the agenda, which is new business consisting of what this subcommittee role and objectives would be, potential subcommittee advisors, identifying funding needs and opportunities, subcommittee members discussion, action items, and scheduling public comment before adjourning. So any comments on the agenda? All in favor of the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
So I think it'd be good to start off with talking about the subcommittee and what we're trying to achieve here and what should be incorporated in the phase 2 report that is due at the end of 2024. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to kick off the discussion.
Thanks, Sean. So this is an overview. Before we get into the details of this subcommittee, just to provide an overview and framing of what we're looking to accomplish in phase 2 of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan and how we will be presenting that information. So there's 2 major deliverables for phase 2, an updated Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, which we used in phase 1. It shows our hazards, the impacts, community context, projects and initiatives, and funding. I'm looking to update that, as well as a standalone PDF document plan, more summarizing the actions, some report to memorialize what we accomplished in phase 2, where the Web Explorer will be more of a living document that can be updated over time. The key components of these deliverables are derived from an enactment clause from House Bill 516, Senate Bill 551, and 22 General Assembly as to what we need to have for phase 2 for December of 24. It includes all major sources of flooding, so fluvial, and coastal flooding, an updated impact assessment, and and an inventory of projects. So those items are covered in items 1 and 2 on the components, as well as 3 of planned resilience actions. The financial need for flood resilience is not a requirement of code, but we do think it is important to try to build on what we did in phase 1. And so we do have flexibility and the opportunity to define what is the most important information to put into phase 2 to try to make it more actionable. And it's not just funding needs, just dollars for resilience, which is hard to come around, but we have a much broader, whether there's additional strategies, different funding types, is there resources that are needed? And so that'll be some of our discussions, but it is a broad funding need and information related to funding that we could include in phase 2. The last component of the deliverables are TAC subcommittee recommendations. So the subcommittee is able to provide recommendations, both what we do in this plan, as well as what we should be doing in future planning efforts. So those are the key items we're looking to go through. And there will be outreach and engagement throughout this process. This is a form of outreach and engagement with the TAC, and hearing from your all's input. There will be other opportunities and activities for outreach and engagement throughout this process. Here's where we're looking at as the overall schedule from today, getting out through December of 24 for phase 2. We'll see up top our TAC and subcommittee meetings up top, quarterly basis with the subcommittee meeting preceding a TAC, so that the subcommittee can report out at the TAC meeting and present it in front of a larger body. Then we get into the technical process of the planning effort, where we have our flood hazard data model and updating the major sources of flooding for flood hazard exposure. Underneath each key item is the subcommittee, one of the 4 subcommittees that are primarily responsible for providing input and advising on that part of the process. So with the flood hazard exposure model, we're looking at the research data and innovation subcommittee to provide a lot of input on the data collection, leading us to updated flood hazard risk assessment that be coming primarily from the project prioritization subcommittee. For the actions, also project prioritization, but on the analysis, we do some of the gaps analysis for what's planned in the updated project and initiatives inventory. Funding does have the opportunity, and funding really has the opportunity to comment on all of these aspects, but we're just trying to think where we think we could focus our time based on who's in the room and what we're trying to achieve. Quantifying the financial need for flood resilience is this subcommittee. Starting a little later, we have more flexibility on our schedule for what we want to get done and how it's produced. There aren't as many dependencies, although some of the project and initiative information could help inform a lot of this work for us to move forward in our ongoing outreach and engagement and the subcommittee recommendations. Up top, you'll see Q1 of 2024 is highlighted. We currently have an RFP out for resilience planning and consulting, which will give us additional resources and contractors to help dig into some of these information more. So right now we have limited resources for the funding part of the study, but we plan to bring in additional resources to help us dig into some of these questions that you all may want us to look into. Any comments or questions on the schedule and overall phase 2? All right. So these are 2 items that have been previously provided in front of the TAC and that we've been working through. Is what are the 2 objectives of this subcommittee, and on the work we're doing now, how do we inform, listed as a quantification of financial need for flood resilience? What what data do we need to provide in this plan? What should we be looking at to make it more actionable for the state, the region, and the localities to be more flood resilient? So that's what we're trying to do here. Information long-term as well as kind of guiding appropriations and what is the need to implement some of that work as well. And then develop recommendations for future planning. So what do we need to do moving forward? Some of our wish list items for this plan may need to go to future plans if we don't have the information to support it or the time and the resources to get it done. But we would want to know what information will help not only you, but us move forward in this space in reference to funding and financing and paying for this work effort. This is not set in stone. You all have the ability to add, modify, provide recommendations if there should be any changes to what we're trying to accomplish here in this subcommittee over the next 6 meetings, including today. And we can come back to this. This is not a one and done on the objectives. Any comments or questions here?
I have a just question on number one.
Yes.
The quantification of financial need. Does that mean that we're just trying to see based on proposals submitted for this version, phase 2, how much money is going to be needed overall to address those challenges? Is that in a nutshell?
That is one item, but it's not the limiting. It is not only just we need X million, billion dollars to be flood resilient.
Okay. Is there I guess, thinking about, we're never gonna be able to fund all the projects, right?
Correct.
And probably maybe our lifetime. But is there a way in this process to basically add significance to what's really important? And then you have kind of a more strategic view of yeah, we've got all this on the table, but here's where it's starting in this area. And so that would be my question, because then you at least have direction moving forward in the next, and revisit it every couple of years or something, but just a thought.
I appreciate it.
So, yeah, building on that a little bit, what you want to try to stay away from is the linear thinking that there's a direct correlation between the cash and the resiliency solution that you need to put into play. That's that's what everybody wants. But what you're really talking about is changing consumer behavior. How do you get a homeowner, which 98% of the waterfront is privately owned? That's their asset that's under duress. And so using cash is not the only way to change consumer behavior. And some of the things that I didn't note in here, we're using tax abatement to change behavior, reduce the real estate tax for people to put structures on their shoreline, because protecting the structure holds the value of the real estate, which ensures that tax revenue flows for local government. So you may have to chip away a little bit today to get the protection device in place, but you're assuring that the revenue taxes are continuing to be generated going forward. So using existing tax structure is not listed. Using tax credits is not included. There's a lot that can be done with tax policy to change consumer behavior. And then there's no recognition of how currently private companies are using arm's length transaction for carbon sequestration or nutrient credits as other financing tools, where they are able to pencil out a profit through their business model at no cost to the homeowner. So the homeowner gets a free shoreline protection in exchange for the in perpetuity revenue that's generated from carbon sequestration or nitrogen removal. So that there's a lot of tax policy and credits that result in the change of behavior that you're looking for that is not directly tied to cash or loans. So that probably needs to have a place in here.
and I think it does, would you say kind of like leveraging, I mean, I don't know if it's funding or finance, leveraging dollars to change behaviors? So the first one, the quantification, people may think kind of what money is needed to directly deal with flooding and kind of the protection. But beyond that, kind of changing how we are doing things, changing policies, how does money work within that, or?
It's using tax policy to inform the quantification of financial need.
Okay.
Because if you can turn tax policy knobs differently, that results in more financial aid being applied that allows you to quantify that need. And so right now, if you don't turn those knobs, it's kind of static. Or you're allowing the private sector innovation to try to figure out how to do it. So it's happening passively. You've got the opportunity to actively talk about it, to say you can really turn tax policy knobs differently to cause an effect in the marketplace.
Any other comments? So I think they would broaden the objective, especially number one, what we're looking at. And we'll get into some discussions later about some more of the questions we may want to try to answer through this process. So subcommittee schedule, just trying to lay out, we have 6 meetings, including today, until phase 2 is due. And laying out what we're trying to accomplish at each of those meetings. So in this first 2 meetings, trying to identify what we want to do with this phase 2 and the broad kind of funding needs. And then trying to prioritize those in the first quarter of phase 1. So if we have a list of all the things we want to do in phase 2, we can then prioritize, see what's feasible, timescale, and then work on getting those done in the rest of the phase 2 to try to get that information into the plan. Then working into next year, whether there's any funding assessments, and some of what this means will show up in a few more slides. But then the last 3 meetings of next year towards recommendations moving beyond this plan.
Did this subcommittee exist during phase 1?
Yes, so there was a finance subcommittee in phase 1. We're going to provide an overview of what information was included in the phase 1 plan
Yeah, that's what the question
in a
was.
few slides.
Okay, good.
And this schedule can change too, but this is just the starting schedule, trying to framing out what can we get done, and this may need to evolve. So any comments or questions? Address them. Maybe we hold the recommendations to change the objective. I think we've heard yours, Louis, and I think maybe we'll come back to that after we get through the next section, and then can work on either adding or modifying that first objective. There's kind of messes with the flow a little bit, but subcommittee advisors. So the chair for the TAC, Secretary Boyles or DCR Director Wells, can appoint advisors to the subcommittees as well as to the full TAC based on recommendations from the subcommittee chair. And those advisors would then be able to participate and attend all of our subcommittee meetings. They would be a non-voting member, but are engaged in the discussions, would be member of the public via, so there are FOIA requirements. There's other options too, as far as getting other information into the subcommittee. We can invite speakers or presenters to come and talk to the subcommittee that might have subject matter expertise that may be needed for that discussion, but they don't necessarily need to be here at every meeting and every, be a member of the public body. So opening that up to you all for any thoughts or discussion for subcommittee advisors.
Well, depending on what you do with the tax question, you may need someone from the Department of Tax.
Yeah. So they may be a presenter, but not a full-time advisor to the group.
This is Rachel at the MRC. I don't have a particular person in mind, but I would like to see some advisors in the private sector that are doing a lot of the work associated with the planning and funding. So I don't know, maybe like Moffett Nickel or someone like that, that really understands how the money's flowing, not just from a public sector, but from a private sector trying to build a business off of this. But I don't have anyone to nominate.
Okay. People brought up the insurance industry as well as another, whether they're an advisor or presenter.
Parametric insurance.
Yes.
We do have a name, the name escapes me, it's on the notes, I can't say. Somebody that's participating in the RISE Insurance Challenge.
Yeah.
Paul Robinson had given us a name as well for a potential advisor, or we could have them as a presenter, depending on the need.
Yeah, I'm not sure with the ones that Paul's working with, whether or not those are established with a track record of providing parametric insurance versus companies that are actively providing coverage in Florida that can speak to a longer lens of how parametric is applied in that space. That's a mission critical missing tool. Because anything that's at risk to flooding, FEMA will cover the structure, the house. They're not going to cover the shoreline structure. They're not going to cover the bulkhead. They're not going to cover the septic system. All of the assets that are at risk to flooding, homeowners and flood insurance won't cover it, but parametric insurance will. It's a very critical missing part in that financial mixture.
Additionally, they also provide immediate financial support to those who insure in many cases.
Yeah, instantaneous. Upon the trigger event happening, here comes the check.
Yeah.
And most of the companies right now, the limiting factor for not being able to provide parametric insurance, at least on the waterfront, we don't have the correct tide gauges in Virginia. So the tide gauges that Virginia has are not NWLON, which is a NOAA standard. It's the Cadillac NOAA standard. So the bean counters in the parametric insurance industry can only use the data output from tide gauges to set premiums that meet a certain data integrity level. And the Virginia tide gauges don't meet that. And so until we can figure out how to get the correct tide gauges into Virginia, it's unlikely that we're going to see parametric insurance, because the next controlling variable is wind. And so when we began to look at pricing out policies using wind data, the premium costs were just way too high for what the individual consumer would be able to afford. And so the only way that you can lower the premium cost is to have data that's closer to the insured asset. And that's what the tide gauge data would allow you to do, is to be able to drive the premium cost down to a more affordable level.
So that could be a need that we could investigate. Is what is the cost then? How many tide gauges would you need at that level to enable that insurance to be present?
Yes. Yep.
There was work done, I guess, on the databases, the funding database and the project database, which I think the funding one was the DEQ initiative, is that right? And then the project one was at DCR.
Yes and no. The DEQ started, the Coastal Zone Management Program started both the project and the funding database. We took their funding database, added some more fields to it, and put that into the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, and are currently working to enable us to continue to add and update it. Right now, it's a static database as of September of 21, and a lot of those funding opportunities have since closed. We haven't had easy access to add new opportunities, so we're working to add new opportunities, getting help from external partners too, to keep that updated as well. So that is a work in progress. We should have the ability to add new opportunities next month, starting next month, and then get those published to Web Explorer so people can see them. We have added some new links to our website for other funding opportunities, especially where people are aggregating federal funding opportunities. We don't want to recreate what they're doing, but just redirect people to these resources.
So none of what we just talked about would be advisors to the committee, more just invited presenters
I
at this
would
point.
think that's what I'm hearing, yes. And we do have the opportunity to kind of discuss the next agenda, and if we want a certain group to come and present and provide information for us to move forward. All right, so as of now, no full-time advisor recommendations, but that again doesn't limit who DCR can consult with, who you all can consult with, and then bring information back to the group. So now I'm going to get into an overview of some of the information that was covered in phase 1 related to funding and financing of the Coastal Resilience Initiative program. Quantifying the total cost for flood resilience is, I would say, impossible. You can throw a number out there, and we did have numbers from all the projects in our database, but we knew those projects didn't represent everything that was going on, and that would be a low value relative to the need. You could also go the other way if you tried to, there could be a number to try to protect everything. And that's just going to be a very high number that's unrealistic as well. And so we did not quantify a specific dollar need for overall flood resilience in Virginia. I don't know that we can do that in phase 2, but there may be some more specific items, high gauges to allow parametric flood insurance, maybe some protection of critical electrical infrastructure, critical transportation, primary roadways. There could be more specific needs that we might be able to drive towards, but we know we didn't have the time and the information to do that in phase 1. We do have that project and initiatives inventory again. It was collected during a very short window of time, does not include all of the work that is going on. Still an underrepresentation. So in addition to adding the funding opportunities next month, we're going to also have the ability for project owners to continue to add their projects and initiatives that are going on. So we can have more visibility on what is occurring, and maybe more importantly, where is action not occurring, or where is action that's occurring not being reported, and trying to help close those gaps. Our database was based on the DEQ Coastal Zone Management database. They put a lot of effort into that, getting that set up.
So you're talking about the database structure or the actual projects that were in the database? It was some significant concern about how those projects ended up in that database. They were not inputted by the public bodies. They were data mined by an NGO that got the grant. And so many of those projects were never vetted locally to make sure that the local governments or the private citizens even wanted those projects in the database.
Understood. And we did not use the projects and initiatives from DEQ's coastal zone management database. We did our own data call in the summer of 21 for project owners to enter their own information.
Yeah.
What they felt should be included in this. Now, it doesn't mean it's everything, not every stormwater, if you're upgrading a catch basin, was included here. Some people did go very granular, but it gave the project owners the opportunity to share with the Commonwealth and with the public what they felt they're comfortable with and other people should be aware of what's going on. But there were challenges with that just due to we had a very small time window, maybe 4-6 weeks in the summer. There's a lot of other things going on. So that's where now this is going to be a living database of projects. It will continue to evolve as people put their information in and getting feedback from people. We have the opportunity to do some modifications or enhancements to either how that information is collected or shared and used moving forward. So we do want to continue building all this, but we want to hope it's being a useful tool and get feedback from users, both on the projects and initiative side, as well as the funding side.
This is Rachel. I'm not sure when I should stop in for a conversation, but for the first two bullets for the, cost of resilience, one of the struggles that I have with all of these conversations is resilience is such a broad term for protecting lots of different things, and there are going to be winners and losers when you decide on a protection strategy for whatever it is that you're trying to protect. And so one of the things I've been thinking about at VMRC is we need a baseline of what is the value of the particular things that we're trying to protect. So from a VMRC perspective, what is the natural capital of tidal wetlands and fisheries, and how can I track that over time as things happen and things change, and using those economic dollars to determine where I should be putting our efforts for protection. So I think by just trying to fully quantify resilience from a, Virginia perspective it's not possible, but maybe we can break it down into buckets of establishing cost base or value baselines of those things that are most important to protect so that we can start dictating over time where money should be spent. And we can make a cost benefit analysis based off of those values on where should that money actually go.
So Rachel, are you suggesting, which I think I support that idea, that the investment should be wrapped around the public trust doctrine? Since that at its core is what MRC is really managing, their public trust resources.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I guess, yes, that's what I'm saying is, what is the value of the wetland now to the public? And if that wetland changes over time or we lose it, and we're trying to either decide whether we should remove that wetland to protect private property, or we need to be able to do cost benefit analysis of those things. And I don't have that baseline value to start with.
Just some of the conversation that's being had, I'm wondering, just from a subcommittee to subcommittee, is there any potential to have like crossover meetings between this subcommittee and the project prioritization subcommittee, or at least have each subcommittee maybe come to the other and sort of share what's being discussed, what's being accomplished? I think it might be important.
I think it is. The scheduling and time frame is the biggest challenge. There is the opportunity at the full TAC to discuss what we are discussing here, present that out, and then get feedback from the larger public body. And I know those meetings aren't always the most conducive to a lot of discussion, but we could also have, depending on who needs to be involved, offline meetings, as long as we're still meeting the FOIA requirements to try to help share. We can do chair-to-chair conversations as people are available to help inform what does project prioritization need to know, what funding's up to, and vice versa, so that we're both working in the same direction. I think if we have a specific need, we can make it work, and there's different options to make it work. All right, Rachel, I think we're gonna come back to some of those items too, when we get into discussion about what we would like to do in phase two. Just going back to what came out of phase one. The finance subcommittee made some recommendations. One was to establish the resiliency revolving loan fund that has been established. We have the Resilient Virginia revolving loan fund now. There were some other recommendations that we really haven't dug into as much, including financial analysis of adaptation versus abandoning public infrastructure when you relocate or abandon public assets. That was a recommendation that came out. There was another recommendation looking into incorporating more of a regional perspective on these needs and not just within a local jurisdiction or within an individual PDC. Is there a larger need within the region that we need to either quantify or different tools or information that could help us, and then within what time frame would that be? So those are some of the recommendations that came out. Again, got the loan fund established. There's still some other questions out there that we cannot move forward with as of yet. Here. So in the funding section of phase one, we list some of the different options that local and regional jurisdictions can use to help finance or fund some of these resilience options. Not a lot of guidance though on how they can do it. There's some limited case study examples for them. We did survey different organizations in phase one. One of the questions was about paying for resilience, and the majority of the respondents looking for federal funds and grants to fund their resilient opportunities. A small number have used bonds, taxes, fees, public-private partnerships to fund resilience. So I thought it was interesting to see the large desire for federal funds, and what those funds aren't always there, and given the need, I don't know that we'll ever meet the demand that we have. So information was provided. We also had some challenges to securing funding that were documented, but the documentation doesn't go much more beyond these one-line statements. And so just the ability to secure funds is a challenge, the capacity, cost effectiveness. They were described at very high level. And at that high level, it's hard to identify the actual challenge with that and how to come up and try to address it. So these are some options we can look into, maybe having some more use studies, and that's what was stated in the document at the bottom is Commonwealth may look to try to gather some more of these success stories or lessons learned to better share what was effective, what was a challenge, and provide more context and information to help with communicating the message. Because communicating the message at these high-level talking points is not getting us anywhere. So how do we get a little more specific on it and then try to work towards, okay, now we really understand the problem. And the problem will change, vary by region, but we have to try to get into some more of the details on some of these issues. And this is where we can look at which ones do we want to address, and prioritizing what needs to be addressed in this phase, what can be addressed later, what's readily available. So
Can I ask?
discuss, but not the details.
Yeah, I was just wondering, have we defined implicitly, explicitly, like who we envision this using this? Is it all users that we're trying to identify, and sort of what's their level of sophistication on their ability to digest what we're putting in front of them? you know, one of the challenges I think of is, let's say we put a table out and an individual looks through it and says, based off this table, I think I could be eligible for these 2 or 3 grant programs.
Right.
But if they had a little more intimate detail or understanding of the respective grants, they would know my chance of success goes up if I go after this grant versus the other 2. So I'm just kind of wondering, are we trying to cater to a certain user in a good way? But if we're gonna do that, like, who is that end user that we're really trying to get towards?
I don't know that we have a specific answer to that yet, and that has been the challenge. With phase 1, we tried to cover everybody, from the individual that's reading this for the first time, all the way to somebody in a local government, or mayor, somebody in the political appointee. There are so many different use cases, and I think that was the challenge, trying to do it all and not succeeding because we went too general with it. But I think trying to get more targeted with the funding options for a locality and making that something that could be presented to a local board or board of supervisors to try to make it actionable. I think that is something, I mean, you pointed out the gap that we had in phase 1, and that's, we have the opportunity here to hear from you all and think how we should be focusing. But right now, we don't have, we are just doing this. It is still kind of a work in progress.
Following on that, can you go back up one slide to the table? You had the table there with the examples of funding.
This one.
Yeah, the tax incremental financing, the TIPS, I do want to say 1 or 2 things about that, because that's an extremely powerful and underutilized tool that allows local governments to apportion revenue for very specific uses. And the way that you all have that worded, the statutory emphasis for TIPS is on blight. That's why that exists in statute. Water, which is the common enemy of everyone in this case, or temperature, it's Mother Nature making people cranky, is the thing that drives blight. And so the description, and blight takes many different forms. You can have $1 million home that, which we would call rich man's blight, that's suffering from the impact of water, devaluing the real estate asset.
Mm-hmm.
So blight is not singularly limited in the climate context to just the poor, because water doesn't discriminate against the poor or the rich. So knowing that blight is the emphasis, the way that you've got it described, which kind of gets to your question about who's reading it, the little description in here has created the emphasis on highly developed interests. And that isn't, if you're trying to convey the power of the tool, the emphasis should try to be more focused on why that taxing, in this example, why that taxing tool is related to the problem that this committee is trying to work on. And so leveraging on the blight side is probably more powerful than leveraging on the highly developed area interest that's there. You're kind of missing the opportunity to talk about it's a powerful tool that can be utilized in this space to deal with a lot of different ways of defining blight.
I think that's another example where we had the opportunity to expand, right? This was just
Right.
at a table.
That's right.
Blurb.
Yep, just
Should
blurb.
it be a 2-pager that you could hand to somebody and look at? Who would be making those decisions to enact
Right.
those? And then tailoring it to that.
Well, and one thing that might be helpful is if we do have a list like this, to then try to look at each one and what's utilization, what's the challenge if it's not being used. I know this jumped out at me. I just had one in my office, like, go find out why CPA case hasn't taken off.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but at least the rumors I hear is it's not being used very much. So that sort of detail, I think, would be helpful to know if there's something the state can do to make these options more viable,
Yes.
or if it's more that outreach piece. 'Cause in many cases, I think we don't know
Mhm.
if it's broken or if
Mhm.
people just don't know about it.
Right.
Broken is maybe wrong, but
I agree. So the outreach of an option, and then if people are considering it, but they're not sure where to go, providing them with more resources to lead them to a solution, or to show them how to do. And if these are getting implemented at individual localities, instead of them having to figure it out all on their own or talk, right, providing a more of a broader resource that they use it. I understand the process.
Yeah.
We either want to do it or don't, and now here's the steps.
Or maybe even something like a model ordinance or something that just shows the framework of what the actual ordinance would look like if you wanted to install it. Because most of these you would have to build some type of regulatory or ordinance structure, I'm assuming.
It's almost like a funding, almost best management practices.
Yeah,
But I know, but one cheater, but how they can work their way through the process. Could this work for us? I want to learn more, give them a little bit more detail. I actually want to implement it, give them more detail.
It's the logistics of it.
Yeah.
Because if there are barriers, because it's easy to put it up to say the tool is there. But if you're not a very sophisticated local government, but the tool is sophisticated, you're gonna have immediate problems because they're not going to be equipped with figuring out, well, we can have our attorney draft an ordinance, but if we have to work with the Commissioner of Revenue, who now has to embed some level of the project cost in with the real estate tax bill to make sure that it's paid back over time, the structural mechanics get really complicated quickly. And that's enough right there to have your local governments and rural communities go, nope, not doing it.
Right now, are there any resources for local communities from that side to figure that out?
That's what PDCs generally do. And our local governments can't figure it out. They call PDCs and go, what's this thing? How does it work? And then we've got to educate, but we don't get a vote. So we can educate and explain. Then it becomes political will and political courage question, which is very different. Do you have the votes to implement it? Do you want to do that in your jurisdiction?
Right.
Unless it's mandated, which is a different tool.
So potential expansion of this table and we can add more maybe to it. There's other options that aren't here that should be, and more kind of get more structured. Who are we trying to share this information with? What information do they need? Providing that, and then if they want to implement, what are the kind of steps for implementation that would be needed?
there's also a policy concern here that, right now, 43% of all of our resilience funding is coming from grants and loans. And, in 5 years, that's not a sustainable way to think about resilience. So also kind of incorporating, how do we have sustainable resilience funding that's not based off of grants and loans?
Everybody, I mean, it's true, and that might go on the wish list for future, but I mean, it's something we should be documenting, putting in there and working toward at least.
Well, that doesn't say that 43% of them used it. This is talking about the action of applying.
Correct.
Which is.
It's not an actual, how much money they actually got, but they're seeking federal grants and loans more than any other source.
Well, there's only kind of like 3 different sources of revenue in the biggest picture. You've got federal or state grants, federal or state loans, or private capital. And that's the entire universe, because tax credits are still related to revenue. And so there's not a lot of programmatic choices in the financing world when you look at where the money source is from. So they kind of generally fall in those topical buckets, and then how they are distributed after they leave out of that can take many different forms.
And the scale of what's available depends on what you're pulling from. There's so much tax revenue available. which
Right,
may
I mean,
not
there
be-
are local government dollars too.
Yeah.
It's just
Right.
that every local government is
Right.
not, I mean, they're competing with all of their other needs.
Yeah.
And not every local government is appropriating funds for resilience projects.
Because they gotta keep criminals in jail and dealing with solid waste, to keep schools open. It's policy choice at the end of the day. Where do you invest your taxpayer money?
Also wondering if we just need to keep in mind, if the Commonwealth moves forward with creation of an office of the CRO, some of what I understand is that CRO in the office would be a resource for individuals to say, what funding strategies are applicable to me? So are we creating potentially a tool for that office a year from now where they use it just as much as an end user might try to use it?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same information we're
Mhm.
chasing. It would be nice to have a staff, that was focused on this, but we could at least develop it
Yeah, and maybe
through
that,
this process.
where I was maybe trying to go is maybe we can look at it from, let's look at building a very sophisticated deliverable, knowing it would be the CRO's office consuming it and digesting it, and then just simply working with an individual that approached them versus trying to capture all users.
The only thing I would say is there is potentially a need for, somebody at a parcel scale, my house, my business, what can I do? And that, I don't know, on one hand, like, you can Google it and it's out there, but
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth evaluating what's out there, and if we think there's, somebody's putting that information together in a good way versus like, do we really need to create something for Virginia?
So when DCR did the floodplain management plan in 2005, there was a version for individuals, a version for localities, and then the version from the state. So they packaged it up 3 different ways to share it based on the different user. And that's another consideration, and maybe you don't have to present everything different ways, but what does the individual need versus the other, and trying to, I think we could add that to the list, funding and financing for individuals, and work on kind of where does that fall in our priorities of what needs to get done for phase 2. But as long as it's on the list, document it and try to do it again next time, or
Phase 6.
see what you can get done. Yes.
Part of it's one thing to show in the tables where different types of funding sources or financing strategies exist, but that's not going to be enough. You have to have an instrumentality at the other end that is set up from a programmatic structure to administer, move money, deal with permits, deal with reimbursement. That's the limiting, that's the bottleneck in all of this, is that you could be giving away free money, but if the unit of government that is receiving it doesn't have the capacity from an organizational structure to move that free money through the system, it won't happen. And so all this does is just say, hey, there's a whole bunch of opportunities out here, but it doesn't recognize that's not where the problem is. If you have a structure, that structure's mandate is go find resources, and they will go find it if they're directed to go find it. But if you don't have that structure operating in the background, this doesn't matter. That needs to be talked about, that you got to have both of them concurrently. And what's involved with that structure? Can you handle revolving loans? Are you willing to take deeds of trust? Do you have the ability to cash flow? An example, right now we got 11 NOAA NOFOs on the street. Some of these are pushing 25 million. All right, so a lot of the focus was accessing federal money. If they're not reimbursable, that means Rachel is preparing to put one in for MRC. That's $25 million worth of infrastructure to protect public trust resources that are out there. Can VMRC turn over $25 million? Spend it first to get the reimbursement. There's all sorts of programmatic and institutional structures that need more attention in these documents that go beyond just a table that says, here's the money that's available.
Right.
And that you're not seeing that talked about with the same level of detail, because everybody thinks if you just produce the table that shows you where all the money is, the problem's solved. And I don't believe that it's even close to being solved.
And I
Is it-
applied for the money without any of that structure in place, hoping we would build the structure as we got the money, which is not a smart idea, but was the only option.
Yeah, because there's no attention being made to the question about what does the various structures at different governmental units look like? What's the structure at an individual local government unit look like? What's the structure look like at a PDC unit? What's the structure look like at a state agency unit?
Is there any regional structure between PDC and state agency that exists or that's needed? I know you have
We have a structure,
rural-
but that's unusual because my elected officials decided to exercise that political courage and said, build programs and solutions. Don't let your people drown on your watch. So that created the ability for us to figure out what does that structure look like. Until communities are ready to enter that space, they're not going to enter the space absent a natural disaster, which is the space that you all operate in all the time. The attention for implementation is directly related to when the disaster hit. You know, we all know that. They'll ramp up as soon as Mother Nature cleans the game board off. But that is not a ongoing and consistent structure that recognizes government has a responsibility through that protection of public health, safety, and welfare lens. And that until that grand awakening happens at each level of government, you're just hoping that somebody stumbles in and wakes up tomorrow and decides, I'm going to enter this space because we have a responsibility to do that. And I think that's a very different decision-making process that will unfold at a really unusual temporal pace without a mandate saying, local government, you have to do this. It's in the Commonwealth's interest to do this. If there's no mandate, then you leave it to the free will of local governments deciding, or PDCs deciding when their local governments say, yeah, y'all just handle this. We don't know how to do it.
So for hopefully our disasters, we're still lucky for a while.
Yeah.
What actions should we be taking to try to move that forward? Is that more outreach, engage with localities? Do they need more information? Is it just are they aware and not know? Do we not know and need to understand the landscape better?
For us, we were able to move the needle because we attacked it through that protection of public health, safety, and welfare. We got them to understand the cost of doing nothing was directly related to how much tax revenue they could generate. They were losing tax revenue by not doing something. And so that we were able to translate the threat into why they needed to care about the problem and needed to create a structure to mitigate the risk. And that is just something that, you know, it took us almost a decade of working through that process and conversation to get them to the point to go, yeah, it makes sense. And now you look in the rearview mirror and they're like, well, yeah, this was perfectly easy to do. Well, it wasn't. It was really complicated because it takes time to do. And so I can't speak for how other communities, what's preventing them from having the awakening. You know, all I can speak to in my case is how we were able to awaken our folks within the Middle Peninsula. And so what I say to other communities is you're not ready. And I don't know what causes communities to become ready.
Each have different pain points.
Different pain points.
And that's our challenge too, to try to figure out how do we present the right information that leads to action across this whole 8 coastal PDC scale.
Well, I think this goes back to my baseline assessment need of value. So what Louis was saying was he established this baseline tax revenue as the baseline value that you're comparing to make your decisions. From a natural resources perspective, we don't have that yet. We don't have a baseline value. But again, I think we have a need for establishing whatever our major things are that we want to protect, if that's taxes, natural resources, whatever. We need a baseline value in order to understand if the money we're spending is actually doing what we want it to do.
I've got some of those, I think, listed in this kind of investment justification grouping of potential options to consider for phase 2. Natural nature-based project benefits to support justification, but also to your point, Rachel, natural nature-based just value. And how do we list the value for the different resources that we have? We are charged with looking at natural infrastructure impacts. So I think that'll be a key component, but there's some other, like capturing the societal project benefits.
Can we talk a little bit about what you just said? Because I want to make sure that at least everybody in the committee has a working knowledge of the complexities of what you just said and why that is different in Virginia compared to other states. Where you spend money directly relates to who owns that asset. Most of the assets, building and lands, it's privately owned. And so even though you may have a goal to use nature-based projects, you can't force a private homeowner to do anything. They have the same amount of right to let erosion and Mother Nature take it away as they do to protect it. And so that the collision of Virginia being a low water state, meaning that property lines extend out to low water, that's the private property footprint. So much of the things that you're talking about wanting to protect fall within that bundle of sticks from a private property owner's perspective that's there. And you can incentivize the change in behavior to try to get someone within their private property footprint to do something, but you can't force them to do that. And that is the other thing that is continually absent from the conversation about who owns that piece of project that you're talking about. And then just if it's privately owned and they don't want to play, you can't force them to play. There's nothing that you can do. There's absolutely nothing. And so that's a really important distinction that just does not show up about the relationship between where you spend money and who owns that asset. And then how do those two things either harmonize and work together or not? Because what Rachel is talking some about, those ecological value things, a lot of that is on private property. So it may have the highest off the chart value in terms of a model, but if that homeowner that owns that marsh and wetland doesn't want to play, can't do anything with it. Now you go waterward of mean low water, and now you're onto 100% public trust bottom area that is owned by the Commonwealth, and that is a public trust question. And the Commonwealth can spend all the money they want beyond mean low water because there's only one owner of record, Commonwealth of Virginia. And so where you put stuff, who owns it, is critical in this space.
Do we need a public-private? I don't think we have a full picture of land ownership across this scale that I could see on one land, say privately owned versus publicly. We have to go through it.
This has come up several times in lots of different conversations, particularly with the Bay program, because it's the same argument, you know, how are we supposed to reach 85,000 acres of restoration if it's all on private property? Small piece of private property, but yes, we do not have a great data set of where public lands are versus where private lands are, and where those, you know, how we can evaluate for this type of process. So I think that would be amazing if a data set was made.
I can't speak to all federal programs, but the FEMA programs are consistent with what Louis was just saying. They have to volunteer, the homeowner has to say, I want to do this to my structure. And they have to sign off an agreement that they want to do that. So it's true.
The amount of public property in these rural communities, if you were to map it and then scale out and look at the entire Chesapeake Bay, it doesn't even show up on the maps. It is so little. It's like a 5-gallon bucket of sand and you're sprinkling a couple grains into it, is how much public property actually exists on the waterfront compared to the 5-gallon bucket of everything else is private. So the context of what we're talking about gets lost in this. Now, urban areas obviously are very, very different. They got a lot more public infrastructure that needs to be dealt with. But there is I believe an incorrect presumption that there's a lot of either private property or public property all over the place that needs protection, or people just emphasize on the project and don't think about the relationship to the ownership. Like there are all these projects that are out there.
I mean, I do think we need another, I mean, in terms of like trying to think of a scope, another approach at this, how do you protect natural assets? Because we keep talking about it without some of these acknowledgements of like, if it has these ecosystem services that we want to keep, you either have this really incredibly hard challenge of trying to get a whole lot of private property owners to be partners in this, or you have to potentially purchase land to replace these natural features in a, you know, consolidated space. Well, at least that's what we've kind of talked about. I don't know what the answer is, but maybe that is something to put in a scope moving forward.
They have data on it, actually. Yes.
Well, data and like, what's a viable strategy? Because we keep saying we should do this and have really no practical next steps, right? And because, yeah, and
Would you look at what's going on with the Chesapeake Bay program and the WIP and the water quality improvements? And they're trying to get water quality improvements. It's incentivizing private landowners to be more responsible for their lands, to try to drive down inputs. Do you go to incentive base then, or?
that,
To achieve, we have to have a goal though, right, to achieve what we're.
you only have what, incentive base, you have ag, and then, BCAT, right?
Some localities are set up incentives.
You mean like stormwater fee reductions, I mean,
That's back to the tax policy again, about how do you turn the knobs around the tools that are available to change behavior.
So the example I'm thinking of in Hampton, they have the rain grant program without, it's not operational right now, but the idea is that you just give local property owners, residential property owners, the money to do these stormwater management practices.
there are some overlap there, for sure.
All right, changing the way we think about the solution, we can't just build everywhere, especially if we don't own the land, you want to build project control. So then how do you drive change in things you don't have legal ownership to?
Who's deciding that it's important? I mean, that's really at the core, is that it keeps showing up on there.
Right.
But just because it shows up doesn't mean the people that own it think it's important.
I think that's,
A lot of local projects we see come through our shop happen because the private property owner approaches the locality and says, I want to do something about this. So I think that goes back to kind of Wendy's point is our audience, like, I think there is a piece of it we have to look at, like for.
Public outreach,
Yeah.
for them to care, if they knew their wetlands were providing this much value to the overall environment, maybe not to their bank account, but providing value to the community, and that there might be some other incentive kicked in for them to care about protecting the resource that they own and have responsibility.
I mean,
Needs to be a carrot.
CBTA is kind of a space you could work in, but right now
Yeah.
it's not. It's not a very big incentive to get people to, you
In
know,
rural communities, it's a disincentive.
yeah, let more wetlands exist. I mean, we just, there's more to do. I don't even know what to say next.
Question, I just don't know the answer to this. Wetlands, doesn't the state have an interest in how the private owners manage what a document identified as wetlands?
Not from a development perspective, because you really can't develop it. So it exists in its natural state. So there's nothing that requires, so you could look at wetlands being in terms of tidal or non-tidal being a grade, an A+ being the highest quality wetland, and you can have a D- wetland. But there's nothing that forces a homeowner to move from a D to a C to a B to an A. It's just there.
The DEQ is there to prevent the human degradation of the wetlands, so.
So the
Prevent
answer is
human
yes,
impact.
the state does have an interest in what a
If-
private homeowner does to something.
If
that's
they want to
designated
do
wetlands.
something, but it doesn't
They
have,
have to get approvals.
if you want to do something on your land, you
Got
need
it.
approval, but
Okay.
you don't need approval to do nothing.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
there's a regulatory
That's the
structure in
difference.
place.
Yes,
Okay.
and it can continue to erode or degrade or be inundated by just taking no action.
So we're limited in what we can do,
Correct.
yeah.
Without incentives.
And the current regulatory structure only allows us to protect the existing wetlands as they are now, not what we think they will be in 10 or 15 years.
Okay.
So at least from a VMRC perspective, we have no authority over future wetlands, only existing wetlands.
Answer my question.
So I have a few other kind of potential items we could look at, forward-looking data, looking at financial need and trying to maybe narrow that down into better buckets. How much do we think we need to build capacity at a local level, capacity for what, to implement what, but trying to just narrow down how we're looking at the financial need. Talked about critical infrastructure protection, and maybe that gets even smaller based on the different sector. We need to know what critical infrastructure is at threat, but still trying to understand how we break this down. This ties a lot, I think, with our impact assessment too, which we're looking at project prioritization. How do we break up the information so it's more usable and actionable? So that's kind of forward-looking. Existing conditions, do we need to establish or at least document, build awareness of how much money is out there? How much money has historically been there for flood resilience versus what's now? And I don't know if we can even get to a projection of what could be in the future, but just understanding kind of how much money is on the table right now. How is Virginia doing to bring that money in? Is that worth looking into?
You're not talking emergency response, you're talking sustained, right?
Yes, so not, we can't force a disaster here and then claim that money, but of the other kind of grants and funding that's available, how are we doing in capturing that? We can't capture a disaster funding unless there's a disaster, right?
Understood, but some take years to reconcile and mitigate.
Looking at kind of historically, how have we spent money to build flood resilience in the Commonwealth? And what was the different sources of those funds? We're not really tracking it that I know at large scale. I mean, I know you all are tracking what FEMA's distributing.
Yeah,
what you're distributing, but again, because we've got different sources, maybe what DHCD is getting from HUD, what you're getting from FEMA, and pulling in maybe even VDOT, and you're getting some money that be helping us. We haven't really brought it together to show where it's coming from, and again, then we might have an idea of scale, and where can we try to make that piece of the pie a little bigger if there's opportunity.
At least then we see how big or how little the state component is.
Yes, even that too. How much is the state bringing in versus what the locals are bringing in without us?
Yeah.
Some of it may pass through us, so just trying to better understand how the money is flowing right now could be something we could look into. I'm saying could be, I don't know if we can get it done, I'm not the expert at this, but I'm just trying to think of questions we might want to have documented and try to get some more information to answer those. The case studies, I think we could, similar to the document that we produced for phase one, had some project, kind of 2-pagers for project examples. We could also add more on funding examples for those different lists. Again, thinking about the audience, how it's going to be used, but there are opportunities if we know any more information, or think if anybody has a great case study that they think should be shared more broadly, because I think we'll have a little bit broader reach with this plan document. We can start inventorying a list of kind of different options to look at, including in the future. Now, I mean, those are a lot of questions. We'll need to know, those are our desired outputs. Do we have even the inputs to get to them? Do we need to collect additional data? And it might not be something we get done in phase two, but if we can document it, prioritize it, and start working towards that. And is dynamic information needed? So if dynamic information, meaning do you need up-to-date information? If we do this report every 5 years, is that going to be good enough on some of this data? Or are you going to need current year-to-year data, maybe for some different grant applications or other decisions? So trying to understand the inputs that may be needed, and are 5-year snapshots okay for some data, or is this something we want to be able to have access to kind of on demand? Might be a wish list. I don't know if we'll be able to deliver that, but trying to understand the realm of needs from the different stakeholders so that we can try to prioritize what we can get done for phase two and what we start thinking longer term.
So one suggestion that you may want to add on to this, which we also don't see. More direct, I think some context around whether it's the CRO or DCR talking with federal agencies that are pushing money downstream in this resiliency space, asking them specifically, what do they need to see coming out of Virginia proposals to make sure that they score better? And only through that kind of conversation, and the kind of the easy way that I explain it, and this is part of the reason why we've been attracting a lot more money recently, is we stopped with the presumption that we need to convince the funders that our needs are what they need to spend their money on. We changed the philosophy to go, our priorities are your priorities. So if you only want something on a pink sheet of paper, I'm only going to give you a pink sheet of paper every single time until you change your priorities. And I don't think that that kind of conversation is happening, because we've spent all this time identifying all these different funding buckets and saying Virginia needs to do a better job getting to the funders, the federal funding. But if you don't have that understanding with that funder to figure out what do they need to see to get warm and fuzzy? Every Virginia proposal that goes to them, are they warm and fuzzy about it? If they're not, then you really haven't accomplished anything, because you're at the whims of the reviewers. And so that building that rapport and trying to figure out why do we not, and I wish Robbie was still here, because the perfect example is BRIC. Virginia has not been able to access the BRIC infrastructure money because we have not, the collective we have been unable to crack the secret FEMA code of what does it take to make them warm and fuzzy when an application goes into BRIC.
Right.
And every program's got a secret code that you got to crack.
What do we do for phase two to help everything?
Identify who that person is that will make that phone call to say, your money's important to Virginia. How do we do a better job? What's lacking? From a uniformity perspective, we just submitted 50 of these in and 0 got funded. We failed on our end. Why did we fail at that level? What was fundamentally lacking out of the Virginia contingency of proposals that went forward?
The federal agencies don't want to hear from 21 different PDCs in the state.
Well, they will, but I think it's a leadership question. It's a top down. Virginia cares about this. And having that highest level of communication of saying, this is really important. We're losing. All this money's going to other states. So when you stepped out, we were talking about the brick and how we can't figure out how to crack the secret FEMA code. You know, we can continue to throw applications in, but if we can't crack the code, we're wasting time. And so we need to do a better job understanding what is that code? What makes FEMA warm and fuzzy when they're receiving proposals? Because certain communities have cracked it because the money's going somewhere.
I think, I mean, you all, I've been on some of the calls, Debbie's been giving some of the feedback of trying to share that information, but it's hard, it is a hard thing, and how that's done, I guess, at a state level for different programs, I think that will go towards more of the resilient coordination working group.
Right.
The CRO and how that office functions with that kind of hub and spoke model. So I think I'll leave that with that group, but understand that that is the need, even for our coastal resilience, for our funding. Understanding it is good, but we need to sell it better. Right? How do we sell it better to the people that have the dollars?
Because if the dollars don't come.
And what information could we provide to help sell that, right? That's where I think we can come in. If we understand what those needs are and what information they're looking for, how do we provide that at scale as a resource to all the communities or and to ourselves too, to help us be more successful. Okay. Any other thoughts on where we could go in phase two? I think we've covered a lot. I think we'll put it, it'll all be in the meeting minutes and try to line up what we've discussed and maybe have that for a starting point for next quarter. Seeing what else we need to add and maybe start some of the prioritizing what's most important for us to focus on, what we think we can get done. And we can continue to add more items as we think. Any other comments or questions? Decision points now, whether I think there is a lot more to discuss on what we can put into phase two. And we'll bring those back to you all. Do we need to revisit the recommendations for the objectives? Do we want to go back now that we've kind of discussed this in more detail, look at our higher level of objectives and add or edit those? Or restate maybe item number one to be, either item one can be broader to capture it all, or we can add different additional objectives. And this doesn't have to happen today either. I mean, if you all want to submit written requests on how you want this to get changed, you can send those to Sean and CC myself and Giller, and we can start collecting that information to present to you all for next time.
The one thing I heard a couple times was, this is a report, who's gonna use it? I like the concept of practical next steps, that we're doing something with it. So I think the first piece, quantification, financial need, but there also has to be an implementation type component in there somehow.
So we're not necessarily tasked with, correct me if I'm wrong, just the whole structure of the task, like the project prioritization group is actually looking at like how we're actually going.
So
Yeah, I guess that's a different, what I'm looking for is a different.
so they have different objectives. Those objectives, I think, are posted on.
Okay.
Kind of in our calendar. It's hard to get to. We're gonna put them on our webpage, so everybody can see that, public and all. Project prioritization is not prioritizing projects. We're not prioritizing projects in phase 2. Project prioritization was the goal of the framework. These subcommittees match those goals. So it's a bit of a misnomer. They're focusing on kind of the impact assessment and what do we need to know in order to prioritize projects. We still don't have, and they can look at maybe if their region has some, do they want to put forward some priorities that the region should try to accomplish? Maybe regional goals, I don't know if we want to call them goals or strategies yet to get that far, but they have the opportunity to discuss some of that. But every subcommittee will be reporting out at the next TAC meeting and every TAC meeting beyond. So you will hear what is going on there, their key items for discussion. And yeah, if you have any questions that you want in more detail, you can always reach out to myself and we can give you some more information.
What about like adding to our objectives, something along the lines of evaluating the challenges or logistics to use different funding mechanisms?
I think that will go kind of under implementing the funding, right? If we added kind of implementation, how do we get the money to flow? So challenges, I think we can add that. And maybe it's easier if we take all this feedback. I can work on changing those and send those around.
Getting the money to flow from to get to what Whitney was talking about, you got to first have the structure to be able to go after the money. That's a structural thing. Do you have the ability to even go after it? Then if you get it funded, do you have the ability to manage it? Then do you have the ability to disperse it? Then do you have the ability to close it out? And then do you have the ability to do whatever you need to do once you close it out? Which, if it happens to be loans, the structure includes servicing those loans for up to 20 to 30 years. So you have to have all sorts of financial structures in place beyond that grant window related to how the money associated with that project, what are the terms and conditions with that? So again, that's a logistical thing. It's a structural thing. So it's the emphasis, the money is the important part, but if you don't have all these other parts of the machinery, it doesn't work. So you kind of need to show what all those parts of that machinery are and how money kind of touches each one of them. Because if you don't have the whole thing and it's not linked together, it doesn't work.
I'll go to Chris with the VDOT has their project pipeline, which is very kind of where, and we could apply a similar type of thought to the money. From the source to the end, how you start with the concept, those final design and construction and closing out that loan, what's the path, the money pathway and what is needed at each phase.
Each juncture, yeah.
And you can't get from, you can't skip and who's needed at what level, locality, the region, the state, to help peak the funding.
Yeah, Lou's making a good point. I mean, even within VDOT, I'm sure there's others around the table. Whenever we're talking about considering a grant, we're sort of at like a go, no go. Those questions are being asked. Do we have the money to even develop the application? Who's going to administer the grant? Should we receive it? Because that's a hot potato every time. So there's all these resource needs that are just sitting behind the scenes to even make a decision to go after it. And any one of those can kind of shut down a pursuit.
Well, I don't know if it's worth trying to quantify, but this, you know, like your vague statement, like that people don't have the staff capacity to do this. Just, I feel like that's often said, but we don't really kind of break it down. Like, you know, you need to do these, whatever it is, like, you gotta do an application, you have quarterly reports, financial reports, project reports, like, it's turning out there's no people to sign these programs to.
Mhm.
And when we talk about like, you know, for our PDC, the MPO gets a lot of federal dollars for a staff to develop, you know, projects and prioritization, and there's nothing equivalent. So I don't know if we could better describe that shortage, but I do think it's hampering people moving forward. So like, well, maybe we can get one grant, but I can't do another one, you know, until that's done.
Right.
And it's kind of crazy, the pace that.
Like there's a coastal flood hazard across, I think there's 57 localities in this project. And so since we're going now beyond the coastal flood hazard to all major sources, all 57 of those would need a problem or funding to address. And in order to get the grant, I mean, if you looked at the locality scale, how many staff you would need to implement all this and roll that, that's a large number. And so maybe we start to put some numbers down to see, does it need to go to a more regional scale? Can the PDCs handle some of this? Maybe where is the state needed to help align the resources to get it done?
Yeah, and I was just, if I'm hearing Louis and maybe Whitney correctly, do we want to have a narrative discussion on some of this in our deliverables so people understand you gotta know what you're stepping into?
Yeah, I'm not even sure. Well, it is for this committee, right? Funding, if you're
Yeah.
applying a grant, but we're running into this with some of our other federal programs that, and some of the IIJA money is allowing for DQ and VDH to use some of those funds for capacity development at what ultimately would be a grant or a loan recipient so that they have the technical, managerial, and financial in order to handle those funds and the project. So I think what we're talking about is capacity development.
Yeah.
And we're observing this even on the most sophisticated local governments. I mean, there's only a certain amount of bandwidth. They can't do everything. And the focus obviously right now is on some of these federal dollars that have a timeline and everything else is going on the back burner.
Yeah. Right, this need expands beyond coastal resilience. It's just governmental challenges to getting money to flow, not for all problems. So I think that'd be interesting how we can describe it in our context versus.
But I do think this sort of resilience project area has more of an opportunity for some capacity development than some of the other
With all the money that's being thrown out there and being available, which could be another thing that we're quantifying and say, look, here's the opportunity. The feds have all this money, they want to push it down. Are we getting our fair share? Why not? Well, we don't have the people to get it and try to help sell the story and identify where is the improvement needed, which it's needed everywhere, but what are the priorities? Right? What's most important? What is the most important resource that we need to build capacity? Is it at the PDC? Is it at the local? Is it at the state? How do we develop this and kind of figure out what do we need to do next?
Offer a thought, just one thing that hasn't come up very much is the future conditions and just for the group's consideration with our exposure analysis and the risk assessment, at least in phase one, we looked out to the end of the century and thought about, you know, this isn't just about tomorrow or what the needs are today, but also what climate change is doing to this region and what sea level looks like. So just also considering how that works into the funding, you know, what is there something that needs to be represented, not just for addressing immediate needs, but also thinking ahead to what stands to be at risk. And I think it came up a little bit with, you know, making the case and the setting of baseline value, but just something to consider.
Maybe also good for us to talk a little bit about when you touch federal money, Virginia Public Procurement Act is secondary. So there's a whole different federal subculture related to federal procurement. And there's very little expertise in that space. If you want to see federal money grind to a halt, try to ask FEMA a question about interpreting, what does this mean? And it's not because it's a complicated question. It's just difficult because of the size and the scale and how much money's in this space right now and being able to get the attention of, is it a simplified acquisition? And if it is a simplified acquisition, is it 250,000 standard, or do you get to go to subsection B, which is 800,000? Why does that matter? Because that matters on how you move paper to contractors. What type of procurement do you have to use? Do you have to get legal involved? I mean, there's all of these really important logistical questions that if you don't have that capacity to figure that out, it doesn't move. It'll grind to a halt. And these are really fundamental at moving money through the system. When you're just not seeing that. That's the nightmare that you all have to live every day. And it's so difficult, because when we are successful at getting the money, months, if not years, disappear in time as you're trying to figure out, because nobody wants to go to grant jail. At the end of it, we're all responsible for the taxpayer money that we're spending. So you have to do due diligence once you get the federal award to make sure that you don't end up going to grant jail.
Right, we've got, it's 11:37. We've got 20 minutes on the agenda for public comment. There's still a few more slides. So we'll take, at 11:40, we will stop and take public comments. And then if there's time remaining, we can get back into a couple discussion items. So I wanted to, funding opportunity, the Army Corps of Engineers stopped by DCR's office earlier this week. I think it was. There's a couple funding opportunities that we wanted to share. I'm not the experts in these opportunities, but just wanted to build some more awareness. They're not new necessarily, but the cost share opportunities are newer. So planning assistance to states, typically 50-50. There's opportunities for 100% federal funding in economically disadvantaged communities. I've got a slide for what qualifies for that. And then there's also, so that's just for planning, no design, no construction, but the Continuing Authorities Program, the CAP program, also has a pilot program for smaller disadvantaged communities, up to 20 projects, 100% federal funded if you meet the economically disadvantaged communities language. That proposal is due, I think I got a typo, I think it's August 21st, I think it's or October.
It's October.
Is it 20th or 21st? But these links work, and we'll send you the page if you download this. The planning to assistance is more on a rolling basis. So those are out there.
Can I, quickly on that made me think of, it's probably also important for an end user to understand who will administer some of these. There are some federal programs where they maintain an oversight of the administration. So again, going sort of eyes wide open into things, applicants need to know you may not have decision-making control like you believe you're gonna have.
Yep.
That's a really good point for the core discussion. I have been trying to kind of poke and see if these core opportunities, what the value in these core opportunities are, and how much authority do we have over the steering of this funding. And for at least the ones that were just mentioned, we don't have a lot of control over how and when that money is spent. And so I think I am interested to see how, as a group, we discuss, which of these are good for Virginia and which aren't, and how do we make them good for Virginia?
Right, it is 11:40. We're gonna jump to public comments. So any members of the public wish to provide a comment, they can either sign up in person or let us know virtually using the chat. I know we have one online that wishes to provide comment. I'll go first. No? All right, so we have Grace Tucker from EDF who wishes to provide public comment. Grace, if you could limit your time to no more than 5 minutes.
Will not be a problem, Matt. Hi, folks. Grace Tucker. I'm the senior analyst for our Virginia Coast and Watersheds team at Environmental Defense Fund. And I just wanted to flag the earlier discussion around advisors for this subcommittee. I would like to recommend, and if I'm happy to give like some more background on her, but we've got an economist on our team, Carolyn Kowski, who's a national expert on insurance, including parametric insurance. And she's got a number of projects that she's working on, pilot projects with other cities, but the ability to just sort of look across multiple states and best practices for new innovative financing strategies. I think she would be an asset for the subcommittee and could, look across multiple areas and may just be a little bit more accessible than some of the private sector folks who are also going to be, potentially bidding or trying to do work specifically on this in Virginia and might have a harder time in an advisory role. So just wanted to flag that. I can drop her bio and some recent pieces into the chat if folks are interested in looking at those.
Great, thanks, Grace. Any other public comments online? So do we want to go back to the core discussion, funding opportunities at all? Or?
Up to you, I mean, anybody?
Yeah, I've got maybe a couple things I can offer about that, because Rachel's point about the complications of touching core money and when does it benefit you and when does it not benefit you, and how you define benefit is really critical. Kind of the easy way that we talk about it internally within our shop is if you touch core money, the regulatory stack of paper is like this. If you don't touch core money, but you still got to get a permit from them, the regulatory stack of paper is like this. So that's really the trade-off is how much control are you willing to give up and how long can you wait to go through that process, because time and money relates to the urgency of the problem. And so many times for us, we will bypass the core because we can get it solved faster by not going after their money. And that's an individual decision. I think that anybody that's going to go and try to do core projects has to understand before they commit to that is you may not have control and the complications of working with them. It's not a system that's designed for innovation. It's a system that's designed for following rules, and their rules are important to them, and they cannot deviate from their rules, generally speaking. And so you have to accept that structure is there. And so be careful with the carrots that you're always dangling, because you need to understand what you're getting into with it. So we, interestingly enough, Broad Creek and Deltaville, the channel silted in again. And so we happen to have both core money that we're trying to get to and non-core money to try to get to. And so in this weird instance, we are advancing both of them concurrently at the same starting point to see who can get to the finish line first. And the Corps doesn't know. They think it's going to take 12 to 36 months to deal with their permitting stuff just to dredge a small channel that's filled in. And so that's kind of the space that you have to operate in if you're touching those resources.
I think Chris brought it up, kind of the go, no go decision.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very common practice in business development and private industry.
Yeah.
I don't know how many state agencies or localities are familiar with that process or use that. And do they need any guidance on looking at these, whether you have control, kind of any guidance on how to evaluate funding options. Should they invest their time and resources in an opportunity? How do they determine that? And I know it's gonna be different for everybody, but at least maybe giving them questions to consider and guidance as you're pursuing resilience funding. Here's some guidance on things to consider before, are you gonna go forward? And that's not the only checkpoint, right? You have multiple points to make decisions and maybe help them see what that decision tree looks like for resilience funding. That could be a valuable asset, something that could be produced potentially.
I think that would be helpful. This several, we have had questions about if I take this money, does it federalize the project?
Absolutely does.
Yeah, I mean, there, maybe we could put something together in simple language that would help people with that, and, yeah, I appreciate the way you put it, because I was just thinking, I mean, I can tell some horror stories about our no-go, you know, but it gets to be hard to make it objective. Like, is it the person you ended up working with, or is it the system? So whatever we could do to at least prompt. To ask, so you said ask the right question.
Or to know how you can remove some of that hate. Categorical exemptions are not commonly talked about, but there are, if you find a barrier and you can make an argument for categorical exemption, there's a process for that, to recognizing that exists.
What's required, what's recommended, and where do you have flexibility?
Yeah, and they have to evaluate whether, big question is, am I gonna be able to successfully do this? It's kind of like a risk-based thing, like, do I have the expertise, do I have the procurement staff, do I have the financial systems, what if I leave? Like, will it continue, like, is the system there to continue, you know, is it based on the person, or is it based on the structure?
All the no folks that come out, it's like, all right, now we're thinking about it in other agencies, and I mean, coordinating that process, think more working groups, but just making those decisions, what's the success, can we be successful? If we are, can we manage it, implement it? What are we losing? Helping people walk through that process. We can add it to the wish list, whether or not we get it done.
I think one thing to note too is what programs actually come with administrative money to support those pieces. Because some do.
Like the
Whether they
capacity
can-
building part, is that what
Whether
you're
they,
talking about?
well, some of them come with
Some of them.
management administration costs, so like. There could be some money available for them to either bring on some expertise.
Right.
Or hire full-time or hire part-time, you know,
Yeah. And this is where I don't think this information can't be stuck in one person. One, it's not, it's so much,
Right.
every program's so specific, and then you can put it all your eggs in one basket. Turnover, it's gone, and you're rebuilding the system. So figuring out good points of contact to help communicate that and help people through the process. Whether they're getting FEMA money, HUD money, VDOT, wherever wherever the money's coming from, specialists in each of those to help them. And I think the positions somewhat exist depending on different agencies.
Well, I want to give VRA a shout out, because requiring program designs for revolving loan money helps with that continuity of operation. Because the knowledge does not singularly exist with one person, it's memorialized in the book. And that helps to make sure that, we call it, you got hit by a bus. You know, if I got hit by a bus, can my staff carry on? And my answer to them every single time is, go pull the book off the shelf, read it, learn it, it's there for a reason. And the programs that require that and bake that in as a condition of the funding have a much better track record of being able to successfully administer it from conception, cradle to grave.
Any other discussion? We have about 10 minutes left.
Or entertain a motion to adjourn.
Before we adjourn,
Yeah, I'm sorry,
so we're gonna
scheduling.
be preparing meeting minutes. We'll try to highlight the action items, and then we need to work on our objectives and reframing those based on the discussion. Also start putting together this kind of wish list of things we want to put in there to have. Our next meeting will be likely end of October, early November. We hope to have a virtual option, although I say the in-person was a nice discussion today. But I know traveling is a challenge. I think the virtual will be every other, so. We're gonna send out a survey to try to figure out if there are days and times of the week that are currently bad for you. So if you have a standing staff meeting Tuesday afternoon that you know you can't get out of, trying to at least identify some recurring obstacles. We know everybody's schedules are tough and we're gonna try to plan out as best as we can. The Q4 is tough with holidays between Thanksgiving and the winter break. So we will be in touch for that. The location to be determined. If you have specific agenda items, please email Sean and myself. And work on getting those into the discussion. I think that is it. Any other? Yes. So motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Everybody's in favor?
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much.